I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm truly pleased to welcome to the program two of my inestimable and esteemed Carnegie colleagues. Dr. Kateryna Shynkaruk is a non-resident scholar at Carnegie Endowment. She has over 15 years of experience working in academia, think tanks, and diplomatic missions with research interests that cover Eastern Europe in global politics, Ukraine's foreign security policy, and the role of ideas and culture in international relations and diplomacy. Kateryna is a senior lecturer at the Bush School of Government and Public Service in Washington, D.C., and holds a PhD in global political affairs from National Taras Shevchenko University of Kyiv. Eric Ciaramella is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasian program at Carnegie, whose work focuses on Ukraine and Russia. Prior to joining Carnegie, Eric served for 12 years in the U.S. government. As an intelligence analyst, policy official, he was Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, where he helped lead the intelligence community's strategic analysis on the former Soviet Union. He's also served on the NSC staff, first as the director for Ukraine and then as acting senior director for Europe and Russia. He was also a senior political analyst at CIA, where he specialized in Europe and the former Soviet Union. You know, when we scheduled this session, we had no way of anticipating the events that would unfold in Russia over the better part of the last week. And I must say, I spent 5 or 6 years in the intelligence community as an analyst in INR, it's Department of State. It's really hard to divine, even with the help of, if we had her Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi, reading the best of Godin trails, what all of this means. And I think it's a time for analytical humility. For months, we dismissed Yevgeny Prigozhin as a sideshow. And now it seems to me, I don't want to be too critical and too unfair, but the bent of the analysis seems to be that we are now witnessing the beginning of the end of the Putin regime as we know it. Maybe that's fair. De Gaulle argued that the key to leadership is the mystique of power. And once that's stripped away, it's very hard to get it back. One analyst over the weekend used the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy's little dog Toto, pulling away the curtain, revealing the old man, the wizard. Is that what's happened here? Is Putin much diminished as a consequence of this? And does he face serious challenges with respect to divisions within the Russian military? More questions than answers. And today, I want to focus our conversation not just on the Prigozhin mutiny, but also on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. We have Kateryna here, so we can also talk about internal Ukrainian politics, and Eric, who's done a lot of work on Ukrainian security as we move toward the NATO summit in Vilnius next month. So, to begin, Eric, to you first. Just a general question for the lay human. What does all this mean? What did we witness over the last week, and why did we witness it?
Well, thanks, Aaron. It's great to be here. And, as you rightly said, we have to have some analytic humility, seeing dramatic events like this play out in a rather unexpected way. And being able to sort of project into the future is obviously a very, very difficult task. So, my general conclusion at this point is, this chapter between Putin and Prigozhin is over, but the story is going to take much longer to play out. And we shouldn't rush to hasty conclusions about, both Prigozhin's future and the future of Wagner, as well as the stability of the Putin regime. So, just to kind of zoom out a little bit, step back, and talk about the context for how and why this happened. Prigozhin and his commanders in the Wagner mercenary group have been extremely unhappy with the top Russian military brass, with Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and with Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. And this has been, in the making for a long time, really since kind of the early days of Russia's full-scale invasion last year. And the war of words between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense had been escalating over the past several months, particularly over this question of whether the Defense Ministry was supplying enough ammunition shells to Wagner forces that had been, fighting the brunt of Russia's attack against Ukraine in the city of Bakhmut. And, what added to this kind of frustration, it seems, on the side of the Wagner forces was that the Defense Ministry made a move within the past several weeks to order private military companies and their fighters to sign official contracts with the Defense Ministry with a deadline of July 1st. And at first, it wasn't clear whether Putin was going to back this measure, and then he did. And so this deadline was fast approaching. As I said, Prigozhin had been making his displeasure known for many months, with these increasingly pointed statements. And so in a broad sense, the fact that this was escalating wasn't a huge surprise. Although in the end, it played out in a rather shocking way. Prigozhin felt Putin wasn't listening to him. He felt it was a personal affront after Wagner had, suffered heavy losses, in Bakhmut, and he decided to take dramatic action. And this was a total miscalculation on his part of a delusional person who felt that he was untouchable because he had brought Russia this quote unquote, great victory in Bakhmut. It's really not clear what Prigozhin expected. He was a bit of, the dog who caught the car in this situation. There was an article this morning from the Wall Street Journal that, that suggested Prigozhin possibly hoped to capture Shoigu and Gerasimov during a visit to Rostov, but that the FSB possibly found out about it in advance and they didn't travel there. And then it put all of Prigozhin's plans, into turmoil. Again, all of that is just, it's very hard to believe, again, that he kind of made these logical kind of leaps and decided to launch this thing. Another outstanding question is, what did Vladimir Putin know and when did he know it? From what I can tell, especially with this new, article from the Journal and other reporting, he seems to have had some heads up that there was a more dramatic action in the making, perhaps not exactly knowing what it was going to look like, but he procrastinated, which seems to be, an increasingly clear feature of his leadership. And so he let it get to this boiling point where it all spilled over last Friday evening. Putin's actions are a bit hard to explain in this situation. I mean, he gave this fiery speech about, traitors and 1917. And then the next day he announces this amnesty and had to go through the humiliating step of asking the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, to mediate this dispute. And again, it's very strange to watch Putin be put in this position. Now he appears to be trying to separate Prigozhin from the rest of Wagner. And of course, not saying Prigozhin's name, which is a suggestion of, how he kind of perceives him as an internal enemy, because this happens with Alexei Navalny as well, the leader of the opposition, where Putin won't pronounce his name in public. But, Putin seems to be trying to paint Prigozhin as this corrupt, self-interested oligarch, which of course he is. But that was also Prigozhin's sort of critique of the regime as well. So, they're just recycling these grievances against each other. But Putin is trying to separate Prigozhin, the man, from Wagner, the fighters, recognizing that, the Wagner forces actually are fairly popular in certain parts of Russian society. And so he's gone out of his way, tying himself in knots to try and, separate the mutineers and the leadership from the patriots, quote unquote, who have been fighting on Russia's behalf. So that's sort of, kind of how we got here in the context.
Let me just follow up with one question. Let's assume Prigozhin is a foil in the sense he's an actor, he's acted, but his real significance is in what his actions revealed about the system in which Putin operates. There was a piece in the New York Times this morning that suggests that Surovikin had knowledge of this, foreknowledge, may even have enabled it, which suggests that Prigozhin was expecting more support from inside the Russian military. Does it, what Tony Blinken referred to this as a sort of crack in Putin's system. Does this tell us much?
So, Surovikin, who's the commander of the Air Force and was briefly put in charge of the operation in Ukraine in the fall, has been sort of allied with Prigozhin over the past several months and has clearly had some criticism of Gerasimov and Shoigu himself. And I think what this revealed is that there's significant chunks of the sort of so-called ultra-patriotic camp, the nationalist camp, and particularly the forces that have been fighting in Ukraine, that are unhappy with the way the war has been prosecuted. And just to be clear, this was not a dispute over whether Russia should have illegally invaded Ukraine in the first place. This is a dispute over how to prosecute the war more effectively from the Russian standpoint. So, I wouldn't kind of jump to a hasty conclusion that this reveals some great split that the West has been trying to bring about, where about a significant chunk of society would sort of rise up and say, please put an end to this senseless war. The main point of argument here was Prigozhin thought that Russian forces were not killing and bombing Ukrainian civilians in an efficient enough manner. So This is about the degree of brutality. It's not about the logic of the war overall.
Kateryna, over to you. I know you were in Kyiv in May, but before we get to that, because we'd like to hear your views on what your takeaways were from your last trip. How is Kyiv reading events of the last week? Is it a tactical shift? Will it produce a tactical shift? Or are they pretty cautious in their assessment of what this means for their counteroffensive and the war in general?
Thank you, Aaron. This is a great question. So I think to begin with a tactical level, I don't see any signs of overly optimistic interpretations of these events in Kyiv that would really affect the tactics of the counteroffensive. On this note, I should say that among analysts and experts, there is a sort of a consensus that, to quote another literature piece, Book of the Jungle, Akela missed his kill. And so it was quite visible manifestation of weakness on the side of Putin's regime. But again, I don't see any way it will affect Ukraine's tactics immediately. On the strategic side, it would be fair to say that with Russia's invasion of February 2022, there were quite a consensus among regional analysts, specifically in Ukraine, that this is a strategic mistake that would eventually lead Russia to some sort of, stage 3 of the collapse of the Russian Empire, stage 1 being 1917, stage 2 being 1991. So from this, more strategic view, it is seen as a logical development. But again, interpreted in cautious terms for the military purposes.
Yeah, so the talking points on the part of Kyiv have not changed. Zelensky and company aren't saying, you see, the Russian regime is weak, it's vulnerable, therefore we need more support. This is a moment. We have to seize the moment in order to act in a much more comprehensive and aggressive way. Is there any sense of that?
I think that these developments, they reinforce the talking points that have already been there initially. You see, these developments, they actually look more like a confirmation of the arguments laid forth by Kiev and other Central and Eastern European countries that were part, for instance, of the Warsaw Bloc. So to them, it was maybe more clear that at some point the developments may take this turn. So I would say that qualitatively, it doesn't change the assessment of the situation. It maybe provides more arguments when talking to the skeptics.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So you were in Kiev in May. What struck you that might be of interest to the discussion that we're having today?
So the moods were quite realistic and down to earth. That was probably something that I was not reading in the media until I started talking to the people on the ground. And so speaking, for instance, of the counteroffensive or the potential, ending of the war, everybody is realistic how costly endeavor it is to actually move forward and liberate Ukraine's lands. And there's definitely very little bravado, in terms of how easy it may be. And the expectations are quite cautious. And what I also find interesting is that I do not actually see the leadership being under, strong pressure by society to deliver some, impressive results. Obviously, there is a hope that this all will end. There is a hope that 2023 will be a turning point in the war. All these hopes are out there, but given that almost everyone in Ukraine has a relative or a friend in the army, and they understand the costs from the first-hand information, there is no such, unrealistic pressure as one may get impression from the media.
Yeah, that's I think a very insightful point. We're going to return to this because I want to ask you a little bit later on whether or not the war has created a suspension of internal politics, and whether there are now real politics. And by that, I mean dynamic tensions, creative or destructive tensions that are at work. But before we leave Yevgeny Prigozhin, Eric, one question. I know you're reading coffee grinds and tea leaves here, and everyone will be, as if this situation still has the potential to change on a day-to-day basis. What should we be looking for in the course of the next several weeks and months with respect to Russia internal?
Sure. So, I have a sort of a list of a few things that I would consider to be indicators of the way that this, mutiny is going to be playing out over the medium and long term. So the first kind of real litmus test is whether or not Putin ends up making major personnel changes at the top. Putin has known for a while that Shoigu and Gerasimov are unpopular with wide swaths of, the military and kind of paramilitary forces, but he's clung to them because they've been loyal deputies, and that's part of the way that he governs. He sticks with the people that he trusts and who have done, his bidding over the years. Now, we don't really understand the terms of this, quote unquote deal that Lukashenko brokered between Putin and Prigozhin. And so, again, there was a rumor that possibly he would replace these two individuals, but we'll have to see how that plays out. If he does actually replace them, it's an obvious sign that he was in a much more vulnerable position than it seems, and that he had to agree to Prigozhin's demands. If he doesn't, and if he clings to them, then it just, reinforces this kind of dissatisfaction that's been brewing for many, many months. And it makes a lot of, kind of pro-regime forces even more upset with his indecision. So that's number one kind of indicator, the personnel changes. A subset to that, you mentioned Surovikin. Again, this new kind of revelations that he may or may not have known, again, it's very hard to say from the outside, what this really means and how much he might have known. But, if Putin distrusts Surovikin enough to remove him, that would also be a sign, I think, that there was actually wider support for this rebellion within the military. And that also poses significant questions. So we'll see there. Number one, that's personnel changes. Number two, I think we don't really know what is going to happen with Prigozhin. And so we have to see, how does he reemerge in Belarus? Under what circumstances? Does he have access to his social media and Telegram, where he's still, lobbing these really provocative messages and getting his, troops fired up and kind of critiquing the regime in a way that no one else has really been able to? Does he end up getting a lot of Wagner fighters to relocate with him to Belarus? I think that's still an open question. So we should see kind of indications of that, at least early indications in the next few weeks. The third one is this issue of, whether or not Wagner is going to hand over their heavy weapons. I mean, they've been equipped with everything, tanks, artillery, you name it, air defense systems. And the Ministry of Defense has said that Wagner will hand it over, but this is not going to be a cakewalk. So, how is this actually going to play out? Is there going to be resistance? Are we going to see firefights between Wagner and MOD? Let's see how that plays out. And then we'll start to have a sense of whether it's going to impact, actually Russian kind of performance in Ukraine. And then the final thing to look at is what happens to Wagner's deployments around the world, particularly in Africa, where they've inserted themselves into a number of countries to prop up authoritarian regimes and to gain access to, minerals and other, to kind of be this, private Praetorian Guard for these different regimes. This sort of puts the Kremlin in a bind, because obviously they want to rein Wagner in, but Wagner has played a unique role on behalf of the regime in extending its power in this kind of low-cost way. So, the Kremlin is going to have to balance between wanting to rein in Wagner and not kind of collapsing their operations overseas, which are, a huge asset to Putin.
So let's move now to the counteroffensive. I'm struggling. I've struggled over the last 18 months as to whether time is an ally or an adversary for Ukraine. Is it an ally or is it an adversary? And I think clearly the mood in the media and among many analysts has shifted since the sort of dramatic breakthroughs, military breakthroughs over the past year, and what now appears to be a much more realistic assessment of the prospects for a counter-offensive. So, Kateryna, first to you. You mentioned there are lowered expectations. If you had to identify, I know you're not a military analyst, but if you had to identify what would constitute a success, what would it be?
That's really a good question, because I don't think there is even understanding in Kyiv right now what is the end goal of this counteroffensive, in terms of how much success is feasible. For the moment, there is a combination of defensive and offensive operations on the front line. And the reports suggest that even successful defense is seen as an achievement, given that the enemy prevails in troops, in equipment, and has been able to build multiple levels of fortifications in preparing for the counteroffensive. So it is really hard to say what could be seen as a success in realistic terms. The expectation, of course, initially was to achieve significant progress in the south of Ukraine, getting closer to the Crimea bridge, and these were the expectations. I would also be cautiously optimistic, about how quickly those results can delivered. So it started just a few weeks ago, and there might be some, expectations as a Ukrainian military warn against, watching it as some sort of Hunger Games. So this will not be, a sort of impressive show, but slowly the progress actually can be achieved. And one of the deadlines I heard in Kyiv was November. So maybe it will be correct to judge what has been achieved by then. So I would be, cautiously optimistic here.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-on. So you would suggest that Zelensky is not under tremendous pressure, does not appear to be under tremendous pressure to achieve a dramatic breakthrough, cutting Crimea off from, or dividing the South into two, cutting Crimea off from the Donbass. That is not. I mean, that would be a dramatic achievement, presumably. Is he under pressure?
I would say that the pressure here is more external. It is higher externally than internally. There is, more realistic and down-to-earth assessment, I think, on the ground than. And of course, the military and the political leadership, Zelensky, they realize how important it is to keep the progress going, including for the purposes of getting more assistance. But to look at it the other way around, assistance is needed to achieve those impressive results.
Yes. And that's, I guess, where the issue of showing results becomes very important. Eric, over to you. What would constitute success, or how are you reading the Ukrainian counteroffensive? And if I could, what do you expect the administration, our administration, the Biden administration, wants from this?
Sure. Well, I think we're still in kind of the first phase of the counteroffensive, and it's not clear whether and to what extent Ukraine has committed all of its reserve forces to this counteroffensive. My understanding is there's still analysis ongoing about what the weakest points in the Russian defense are, and that there will be a decision eventually made about trying to exploit those. And so there's a certain amount of, again, caution on Ukraine's side to make sure that any major moves forward are going to be successful. And, Kateryna made the very important point that, the pressure primarily that Kyiv is facing is not domestic, but from, Western partners who, on the one hand, say, any good military operation should be conditions-based and not according to a fixed timeline. On the other hand, they say hurry up and deliver, and we've got our own constituencies in Congress and whatnot to show that we're backing a winner. And I think that's, it's understandable, but it's unhelpful. And I hope and presume that, much more informed conversations are happening behind the scenes that are doing a really solid assessment of the battlefield in order to set Ukraine up for success.
Right. The academics who study wars, particularly interstate wars, have some interesting research. I mean, using history, which is not always the best guide to explain the present, but study out of the University of Chicago suggested that the average war since 1815 lasted 3 months. CSIS, with some data compiled by Uppsala University, went on to say that 26% of interstate wars end in less than a month. This was from 1946 to 2011. And 25% end within a year. If they go on longer than a year, they extend to a decade or more. So the administration has been very, I guess understandably, cautious about predicting an end game, let alone a timetable. But there is a logic which is linked to the counteroffensive, which is this. The logic appears to be that Ukraine at some point would quote, to a direct quote, if Ukraine could tilt the battlefield in favor or against Putin, then Putin would begin to understand the importance of coming to the table. And the president had a piece in the New York Times in May indicating that this has to end with a negotiation. So so on one track you have the counteroffensive, and on the other you have this sense of trying to provide enough support so that Ukraine could accomplish a set of goals which would then what? Pave the way for some sort of diplomacy?
Mm-hmm. So, on the question of the duration, I mean, I would just, remind listeners that this war hasn't been going on for just 16 months. It's been going on for 9 years already. And prior to the full-scale invasion, the UN had estimated between 13 and 15,000 people had already been killed. And of course, something like 8 to 10% of Ukraine's territory was already under foreign occupation. So this is a continuation war rather than a war that just started last year.
Right.
And, I think that Kyiv was realistic, and a lot of analysts who were looking at this were realistic that the counteroffensive was unlikely to end the war. That even if there were some kind of spectacular progress in terms of retaking, and liberating Ukrainian territory from occupation, that the state of war would still exist, between Ukraine and Russia, and that probably by the end of the year, some portion of Ukrainian land would still be under occupation. And so that this war would definitely, seep into next year. And I think that's, become even clearer now to outside observers who might have hoped for something more kind of magical, a little bit of fairy dust that could be sprinkled, and then suddenly the war would be over by the end of the year. That's not going to happen. So, in terms of, your kind of two questions about, whose side is time on, what does the success look like? I think that, we have to start preparing realistically for a long war and doing what we can as the West to ensure that frameworks are in place for Ukraine's long-term security and ability to deter further attack and to defend, and ideally over time to liberate territory and take advantage of opportunities that come up. So, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this later in the podcast, but I do think a success that could come out of this by the end of the year is to have a very, very clear and realistic, enduring framework for Western support for Ukraine, such that Putin no longer has the mistaken belief that time is on his side and he can simply wait for a new American president or for, Western attention to be distracted elsewhere.
Yeah. Someone said that as important as the will to fight is, the will to fund is just as important. Kateryna, I want to take advantage of the fact that you have a real insight into internal Ukrainian politics. A long war means the importance of consensus within Ukraine, as well as within the United States. So is it fair to say that domestic politics has more or less been suspended in Ukraine, and that Zelensky has a pretty good mandate without much internal opposition in order to carry this war on?
Thank you, Aaron. I would say it's fair to say that internal politics has been a low-intensity conflict since the 2022 invasion, as compared to a very high-intensity one before February 2022. And the new social contract has emerged during the war, where every stakeholder, the society, civil society organizations, political parties, including the opposition, everybody understands that the survival of the state, survival of the Ukrainian statehood is priority number one. Everybody is vested there. To quote one of the opposition politicians at the beginning of the invasion, if Russia succeeds, we will be all hanging on same trees. So this is to say that to some degree, this has been a major unifying factor. And of course, the popular support currently hits over 90% for the armed forces of Ukraine, but also for the President Zelensky. Another factor that has been working, as sort of as a freezer for all this kind of internal politics is the martial law, which is objective. It imposes objective limitations on politics, including making parliamentary sessions closed without access of the media, to the dismay of opposition. Similarly, the media are now united under the so-called United News project, where all major TV channels are just showing same news. And of course, some opposition leaders are not happy with the coverage. But I think all in all, we are seeing, as I said, a sort of suspension of internal political conflict.
The oligarchs had played a central role in Ukrainian politics. Has their influence and power been diminished as a consequence of, well, destruction of infrastructure, lack of access to their resources, whether they're agricultural or mining or in terms of exports by sea? Has that fundamentally undermined their power?
Well, some of them are out of the country. Some of them are in the country and keeping low profile. Others are still keep funding some initiatives that are of benefit for Ukraine and its victory, like international forums that, for instance, are supported by Viktor Pinchuk. So I would say that overall, if there is an access that they are still having, it is only to the extent that they can be of help to this primary goal of state survival.
Yeah.
And if we're talking, for instance, about Kolomoisky, he has been under prosecution. So I would say that they definitely lost their leverage, similarly to other political actors under these conditions of focus on the state survival.
Yeah. Just in terms of the notion of hanging together, one of our own revolutionaries, Sam Adams, basically said the same thing in response to American independence. We're either going to hang together or hang separately. That survival mode obviously diminishes opposition to Zelensky. There is a presidential election at some point.
So the elections are suspended until the end of the martial law. So this is according to the law, it is impossible. So the question is when the martial law could actually be stopped and elections held. For the moment, the official Kiev position is that there is no prospect of holding elections anytime soon or until the end of the war, to quote the president, specifically for the security reasons.
Yeah.
And here I should say that I do take this argument seriously, because if we are looking at the conditions on the ground, and if we are looking at the political ratings, it would be actually to the advantage of the political forces currently in power to hold elections.
Right.
But the security situation is just not there.
Yeah, fair enough. That makes eminent sense. So next month, NATO 31 members will be convening at Vilnius. The issue of Ukraine's accession to NATO obviously has been talked about, analyzed from all conceivable directions. Compromise proposals have been made. First to you, Eric. I'm assuming that Vilnius and how Mr. Erdogan of Turkey comports himself obviously is a wild card, but I'm assuming that Vilnius will result in a semblance, not even a semblance, the reality of Allied unity. But how will the issue of Ukraine's accession to NATO be handled? Will there be a formal compromise? And then to you, Kateryna, what would constitute an acceptable interim solution to the problem of Ukraine and NATO? Eric, to you first.
So, it's become fairly clear that there is not consensus among the allies to bring Ukraine into NATO now while the war is ongoing, for pretty obvious reasons, which are that either, if Ukraine were to enter NATO while Russian forces were still occupying and actively fighting, either NATO would have to redefine Article 5 to mean something less in the case of Ukraine, which is a bad thing for Ukraine and for the alliance, or NATO forces would have to enter a direct war with Russia, which would also be quite bad for everyone. Or Ukraine would have to formally kind of accept that only the territory under its control would be protected by Article 5, which is, this kind of West German scenario that's been talked about, which on the one hand is a model for a country entering a military alliance while it's in a state of partition. What people don't talk about, again, is that, West Germany had to make a strategic decision. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer had to sign away, essentially, East Germany before NATO accession in 1955. And there was no understanding in West German society about when, unification of Germany would take place. And so, I would be interested in Kateryna's view, but it doesn't seem like there is really support in Ukrainian society at this point to accept a formal territorial partition. Perhaps that's down the line in a circumstance where NATO is actually ready to move on membership, but it seems very premature. So in the absence of, an invitation to join the alliance, what I'm understanding is that the allies are trying to find a way to signal that, membership is, an eventuality, as it's been promised to Ukraine since the Bucharest summit in 2008, where the allies agreed that Ukraine will eventually become a member of the alliance, and that some of the obstacles that had been in the way, such as a membership action plan, might not need to be fulfilled in the future, and that there could be an expedited process when conditions permit. And so, again, it is a compromise, and it's a half signal that this could move forward expeditiously in the future, but that we're not quite ready to get to the stage, to get the ball rolling.
And Kateryna, to you, are the expectations as realistic as Eric suggests within Ukraine as to what the summit will produce?
I would say that the expectations are still very high in terms of getting some sort of qualitative change in the language related to Ukraine's membership, something that should make a real difference as compared to the language of the Bucharest Summit 2008. I would also, as a side note, add that while this war of aggression by Russia is seen in Ukraine, obviously as a land grab, there is a very important second dimension to it, which is keeping Ukraine away from Euro-Atlantic community and actually using land grab as an instrument to that purpose. So I would say that there is quite a consensus right now in Ukraine that accession to EU and NATO would be actually the victory of Ukraine in this war. And then we could, get back to the secondary question of what it means in terms of lands. But speaking specifically of Vilnius, I'm afraid the expectations are very high. 82% of Ukrainians are in favor of NATO membership. Over 70 Ukraine's think tanks and NGOs have just released an open letter to NATO member states, explaining why it is the right thing to signal to Ukraine that membership is a real thing. And so going again back to the discussion whether it will be some sort of fast track that will be offered without membership action plan, or another conversation about transforming NATO Ukraine Commission to NATO Ukraine Council. All these things will be seen obviously as right, but secondary to some kind of a stronger language. Even without, offering Ukraine to join in Vilnius, the expectation is that the language will be much more clear-cut.
Eric, is that possible?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think the negotiations on this question are going to go down to the wire. I do think there is a desire from allies from many allies to make the language clearer. It's hard to say how, forward-leaning they're going to end up being. And I think, the Biden administration has been trying a bit to refocus the debate less on, a textual reading of whatever communique comes out, because it's still going to, lead to the same kind of immediate outcome, which is that Ukraine still won't be in NATO, even if it's pledged in a stronger sense to be a member later, and to focus more on what can be done on an interim basis, on an urgent interim basis, to enhance Ukraine's long-term security. And that's where we get into these sort of different models that, various people, including myself, have written about in the last few weeks, of this sort of multilateral web of commitments from Western partners to ensure that Ukraine is properly trained and equipped for a future force that's capable of deterring Russian aggression. And so, I've sort of laid this out in a long piece on the Carnegie website and a shorter version on Foreign Affairs that I encourage listeners to take a look at, that reflects, my conversations with American officials and Ukrainians and Europeans about what is actually doable now and realistic and would concretely enhance Ukraine's security now, while these really difficult issues are left unresolved.
Right. It's interesting to both you and Kateryna that Ukrainians, despite the state of Israel's rather ambivalent policy with respect to Ukraine, now there's talk, by the way, of a Netanyahu visit to Kyiv, maybe on his way to see President Xi. But Eric, I know you've done a lot of work, and the administration is clearly thinking about using the U.S.-Israeli model, both in terms of a long-term memorandum of understanding and for supporting not QME, qualitative military edge, but what you call the QBD. Do I have that right? Qualitative deterrent, balance of deterrence.
Yep.
That suggests a real practical effort to provide Ukraine with what it really needs, language notwithstanding, in order to have real security guarantees. But I guess we'll have to wait to see how all of that plays out. We're beyond time. I must say, first of all, I'd offer each of you a chance to offer a final comment, but I would say that it's a wonderful pleasure to have listened to both of you for the last 45 minutes. It's a testament to Carnegie, to your deep authority and expertise on these subjects, and to finding the balance between the world the way it is on one hand and the world the way we want it to be on the other. And that's not sometimes not very emotionally satisfying. But would each of you like to offer a short comment? If not, we'll move on, and you'll definitely have to come back on the show. Eric?
Sure. I mean, I would just thank you, Aaron, for hosting us today. Obviously, with the events over the weekend, it's a very dynamic situation, and so we should continue to keep in touch. And again, be able to analyze what's going on now in the moment, but keep these longer term questions always in mind so that we know the general direction that we're going. I mean, it's very easy to get wrapped up in the day's events and forget the strategic picture. And so I appreciate a conversation like this where we've been able to, analyze on both levels. So thanks.
Thanks. And Kateryna, to you, final word.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Eric. It was a very vibrant, thoughtful conversation that I really enjoyed to be part of. I would maybe wrap up again, going back to the bigger picture, like on whose side is time, and just reiterate that if maybe there is a fatigue on everybody's end, on Putin's, on Ukraine's, on Western's end, but I guess the main difference is that Ukrainians know there's no choice, and some in the West might think there is one. And I guess this is the major difference to keep in mind.
Wonderful. And thanks so much. Again, thanks to both of you, and thanks to Carnegie listeners and viewers for tuning in. Until next time, take care.